When we're examining and encountering various views on what philosophy is and also what philosophy isn't, we get characterizations coming from a number of different perspectives. And you could say that there is no consensus on precisely what counts as philosophy and what doesn't, and what's better, what's worse, what's closer to the core or essence or definition of it. And I think it could be helpful in order to cut through some of this confusion to distinguish between a few different ways in which we use this term philosophy to signify and to signal, to point out some aspects, some dimensions of it that are interconnected and that people might have in mind. So, there's philosophy itself as a discipline, as something that is taught, that is passed on from generation of teachers to students and through the ages. There's also a professional discipline that arises really in the West, you could say, in the current way that we understand it from about the 19th century on, although definitely there was philosophy as a discipline in universities. Before that, there's philosophy as a literature, as things that we can actually point to. When G.E. Moore famously was asked to define philosophy, and he gestured at his bookshelf and said, well, it's all of this stuff here. That's philosophy as literature. And we can talk about, where the boundaries of that are. Is it different than history or religious studies or theology? And there's something to that as well. And then, we can think of philosophy as, in another way, how do we actually wind up with a discipline? How do we wind up with a literature that we can read or take in some way? Philosophy is a kind of activity, and it's very often construed as something like, the top-level activity that other kinds of activities, often represented by disciplines and literatures, flow into. So it could be the science of sciences, or it could be, what happens when we're getting more questioning and abstraction going on. So there's a lot to be said about the activity of the human mind, and we could also say not just a single human minds in relation to each other, that constitutes philosophizing. And then we can also talk about philosophy as something like a vocation that some people take as their orienting principle, their life's work, as their way of life. And there is indeed something that is called philosophy as a way of life that has become recognized since the midpoint of the 20th century onward, associated with that great phrase, philosophy as a way of life with Pierre Hadot, but existing throughout the ages. And in fact, a lot of ancient and medieval and early modern philosophy was philosophy as a way of life. And all four of these, and this is not an entirely comprehensive mapping here, but all four of these are interconnected with each other. And so when people are debating or arguing with each other, well, that's not philosophy, and no, this is philosophy, this is the best philosophy, one person might be thinking in terms of philosophy as a discipline. We don't study that here in our philosophy department. And you can say, well, why not? It's philosophical literature. It could lead to a certain way of living. You may be using the same mental activities, capacities, dispositions to do it as with other things that we call philosophy. Just doesn't happen to be taught here. Instead, it gets taught, like, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville, who's clearly a philosopher, gets taught in political science departments more often than in philosophy departments. And, we could also talk about, too exclusive a focus on, is it published or not? Well, Socrates didn't publish a single thing. People published things about him, including Plato and Xenophon, but also Aeschines and a few other people writing Socratic dialogues. Is that important that somebody has books, articles, blog posts, whatever, to their account? Somebody might focus entirely on philosophy as an activity and say, oh, I'm not a fuddy-duddy like those people in the philosophy departments or the people who are beholden, enslaved to the literature of philosophy. I'm going to make new paths for myself. Unfortunately, what you find out is usually when somebody claims to be doing that, you look in the literature and somebody's already done what they're doing, including that very same, I'm breaking with tradition, right? And all of these, kind of come together and reinforce each other. It could be useful to think about, a prototypical set of philosophers and think about how they figure into this. So let's take Socrates, for example, right? Socrates very, very clearly thinks that philosophy is not just an activity and could become a discipline, although it's not really a discipline in his time. But he sketches out, at least according to Plato, some modes in which that could take place. But he definitely practiced philosophy as a way of life and as a vocation to the point that it got him killed, where he tells them, hey, if you're going to tell me to stop philosophizing or be executed, go ahead and execute me, right? Philosophy as literature does kind of exist at the time that Socrates is teaching all of his friends and students. He mentions Anaxagoras buying his scrolls, reading through them, and saying, "Well, this isn't true." So we also have an entire literature generated around this guy Socrates, right? I mentioned Platonic dialogues, Xenophon's dialogues. There's all sorts of other stories told about him in which he appears as kind of the prototypical philosopher, and by observing these, we're supposed to learn what philosophy as activity consists in. And we can say that for the later discipline of philosophy, philosophers you find it in academic departments and textbooks and things like that, Socrates is at least referenced, if not always understood. A lot of people will say, oh, he's the guy who said, I'm wiser than everyone else because I know that I don't know anything. And that's the tip of the iceberg with Socrates. But you will find, introductory texts talking about his dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living, and then moving on to other things. What about another philosopher? Let's think about René Descartes, considered to be one of the fathers not only of modern philosophy, but of modernity in general. Descartes himself did write things. He generates a literature. Not a vast literature. As a matter of fact, Harry Frankfurt, a great 20th century philosopher, said that one reason he became a Descartes scholar was because when he was looking at the body of literature that he would have to master, he saw that the Cartesian corpus was rather small, and being inclined towards laziness, he decided I'll become a Descartes scholar rather than, taking on the corpus of somebody who had much more writings. He may have been doing some false humility at that time, but Descartes certainly does generate a literature that we still read today. He's also responding to the literature of his time, the literature that he's engaged in. Think about the Meditations on First Philosophy. What follows that? Objections and replies, including from some very famous philosophers in their own respect, like Thomas Hobbes or Pierre Gassendi, both of whom Descartes didn't really get along with, right? Descartes is displaying in that literature a new way of carrying out philosophical activity. He also is looking at the university system of his time and saying philosophy as a discipline is in bad shape. We need to reform it. And we reform it by thinking about the activity and what it would require. Moving away, for example, from the thinking about things in terms of the body and to the mind freed from the body, which we can only do through discipline. And this is where philosophy as a way of life comes in. Descartes sketches out a way of philosophical living that was attractive to many people. For example, in the play Cyrano de Bergerac, right, we find a point where Cyrano actually says, I'm going to read Descartes. Why? Because Descartes was viewed as providing some path forward that one could incorporate into one's life. And let's think about, other people, maybe down the line, we could put them into this matrix and say, where do they fit in with this? A few other points I'd like to make that I think could be helpful for wrapping your head around this. So philosophy is a discipline. It's been around for a long time. There has never been some absolutely agreed upon standards or canon or mode of organization. And at the same time, it's not, well, anything goes. In order to be academic philosophy, traditionally, there has to be somebody who's actually in the position of a teacher, a professor, and they're selected by others. And you could think of it as a guild or a caste. Now, in recent times, of course, it's become professionalized, but in a lot of different ways. So what counts as meeting the requirements of the discipline in one college might not be the same thing as in another college. And so we have this incredibly diverse discipline going on that we call philosophy, with a lot of different things under that heading, and it's often part of an educational structure. In the Middle Ages, philosophy was in the West, what the 7 liberal arts flowed into, and then philosophy was a stopping point before you did your real degree in law, medicine, or theology. But there were people who just practiced philosophy as such in the discipline, just like there were people who specialized in rhetoric. And now, we have people who get their masters or PhDs. It's generally PhD if you want to teach, because there's so many people on the market. And they try to get jobs within the university system. Maybe they're successful, maybe they're not. And then they contribute to the ongoing development of that discipline, a lot of which is, teaching new generations in place. Philosophy is literature. Vast amounts, right? Going all the way back into antiquity. And this also includes not just the original language literature, but also translations. Alexander of Aphrodisias, for example, a great Aristotelian commentator who I'm a big fan of. Most of his stuff was not translated until recent decades into English, so it was largely inaccessible. The person he was commenting on, Aristotle, of course, translations have existed for, a very long time, haven't they? More than a millennium. There's a vast philosophical literature out there. You can see this by going to libraries or bookstores or going online. Much of it is carried out in a variety of different genres, ranging from poetry and drama all the way to very abstract, often mind-numbingly sterile academic articles in journals and everything in between. There is no absolute agreement on where the boundaries of philosophical literature lie. Philosophy is an activity. Oftentimes this can be tied in with understandings of methodology or starting points or the ways in which we're supposed to be engaging in philosophy. And it includes, as I mentioned before, not just what you go off and do in your room by yourself, but also what you do in relation to other philosophers. And that may include going to the literature and saying, well, what does René Descartes, what does Benedict Spinoza, what does David Hume, what does Mary Wollstonecraft have to tell me, to teach me, to throw in my face that I need to then react to and respond to and think through? Partially accept, partially reject, or buy in wholesale. Finally, philosophy as a vocation or as a way of life. This is something that we do see people practicing in large part outside of academia. We live in an extraordinary time in which the internet has opened up access to hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people to engage in philosophy as a way of life outside of the academic discipline, but informed by the literature carrying out the activity and occasionally coinciding with philosophy as a discipline. So these are all important aspects of philosophy. When somebody says philosophy is this, philosophy does this person's a philosopher, this person isn't, you want to ask, well, what sense of philosophy do they have in mind? And this might be helpful for you.